I am writing this as a letter to the version of me who once believed that a child can be abandoned without leaving a crater, because I used to think pain was something you outgrew the way you outgrow a coat. If you are reading, it means you have survived long enough to ask the same old question again. Why did she leave? And why did I stay? My earliest memories are winter memories. Breath turning to needles, ice daggers hanging from the eaves, the stove coughing weak heat into a room that never felt warm. I was 6 when my father's fever stopped being a cold and became a shadow that sat on his chest. He muttered in his sleep, angry words with nowhere to land, and my mother moved through the house like a person trying not to be seen. On the night she ran, she wore my father's old army coat and his rubber boots, because even her escape had to be borrowed. I grabbed her sleeve with both hands and begged to follow. She touched my cheek once, her palm trembling, and said the kind of apology that sounds like a locked door. If I take you, I can't make it. I shouldn't have brought you into this. Then her eyes went flat with determination. If you call someone, I won't forgive you. I opened my mouth to shout for my father's brothers, but the wind packed snow into my throat, and my voice died there. Her silhouette thinned into darkness, swallowed by the field road, and my world became a room with one sick man and one child who didn't know how to be anything else. 2 days later, my father died, and the village treated the funeral like a chore that had to be done before the new year could begin. My aunt, the one married to my father's oldest brother, yanked me by the arm so hard my shoulder popped, shook me in front of the mourners, and hissed, "Did you let your mother go? Cry. That's your father in the ground. Cry." I stared at the straw mat, waiting for tears that wouldn't come. I remembered my father mostly as fists and curses, as the man who said he had paid a bride price to buy a wife and demanded a son as repayment, as the man who called me bad luck when my cough annoyed him. If grief is a kind of love, then perhaps I had none to spend. My uncle spat on the gravel and snarled that he should have traded me away years ago, because a daughter was nothing but loss. The adults argued over my future the way they argued over fertilizer prices. At dusk, the village loudspeaker crackled with reminders about firecrackers, and as the funeral procession passed each courtyard, I was forced to kneel and bow in the snow, to thank people for helping, my knees going numb, until it felt like my legs had been cut off at the hips. When the last clump of earth hit the grave, the calendar said it was almost the 28th of the 12th lunar month. The New Year smell of steamed buns and smoke drifted across lanes while my life, already small, shrank further. No one wanted me. That is the simplest sentence I can write, and it is also the heaviest. My uncle's family insisted I was a jinx who had killed my father and chased my mother away. My aunt complained that school would cost money and that children were liabilities. She had 3 of her own and did not want another mouth. The village secretary, a thin man with a steady voice people called Secretary Liu, listened to the argument in the committee office and finally said, "Blood or not, she is a child. Someone must take her." When my uncle's wife screamed that she would never raise that comet child, Secretary Liu brought me to his own house. It was not generous, it was practical. His home was poor, two children already, an elderly mother who coughed through the night, a wife named Aunt Min who wore patience like a second apron. Yet on the 29th day before New Year, Aunt Min walked to town and bought me a red padded jacket. She brushed the dust off my hair and said, "Kids should look bright for the holiday. Bright brings better luck." I did not believe in luck, but the warmth of the jacket felt like a miracle. On New Year's morning, Secretary Liu told me I had to pay respects at my uncle's house because ritual keeps the village from tearing itself apart. My aunt slammed the door in my face. When she opened it again, the meat dumplings were gone and only the steam remained. Like a joke, she wanted me to smell. I returned to Secretary Liu's home and ate roasted sweet potato by the stove, while his daughter traced characters in charcoal on the floor to teach me to read. In that short stretch, before money entered the picture, I almost learned what safety could feel like. After the Lantern Festival, a remittance slip arrived, 300 yuan, and a brief letter from my mother. She wrote as if I were a package she had misplaced, addressing the secretary with polite distance, asking him to look after the child, promising to send money every month. Secretary Liu did not hide it. He believed secrecy rotted a village faster than mildew. The same afternoon, my aunt arrived with a crying voice and arms stretched wide, calling me her poor niece, swearing she had worried for me night and day. I watched her performance with a child's clear cynicism. She did not want me. She wanted the money. In our village, blood was a banner people waved when convenient, so Secretary Liu's wife could not argue her out of it without becoming cold-hearted. And in the end, I was dragged to my uncle's house, and the 300 yuan a month went with me. The first morning there, I woke before dawn to a kick on my mat and was ordered to carry a bucket nearly as tall as my chest to the pond to wash clothes. The pond surface was sealed with ice. I had to crack a hole, scoop water, and scrub until my fingers split and bled. I fed pigs, collected grass, turned compost, picked vegetables, and ran errands so quickly my feet were always wet. When my aunt bought meat, she bragged to neighbors about how she spoiled me, then cooked it with strong-smelling greens she knew I could not swallow. At the table I was allowed to take 3 bites from each dish and no more. If my chopsticks paused over a 4th bite, her eyes cut me like wire. I learned to press my rice into a tight mound so it looked larger than it was. I learned to keep my head down, to answer, "Yes, Aunt," before the command finished, because speed was the only armor I owned. One summer day, sick with fever after being forced to bathe in a mountain stream, I was left at home to rake grain under a sun that turned the courtyard into a frying pan. My vision swam. The rake felt like an iron gate, and I collapsed face first into sharp husks. When I woke, Secretary Lu's wife was beside me with a bowl of thin egg porridge, and outside my aunt's shrieking voice was colliding with Aunt Min's rare fury. Aunt Min accused my aunt of taking money, but treating me worse than livestock. My aunt sneered that anyone could raise me if they wanted, but the money belonged to her. That night, Secretary Lu gathered the village elders and several households in the committee room and announced a solution so strange it sounded like a superstition: a drawing lots system. Every 2 months, a family would draw a stick. Whoever drew the marked one would host me. Out of my mother's 300 yuan, 250 would go to that household for my food and clothes, and 50 would be set aside in a communal savings pot in my name. Secretary Lu's voice turned hard. "If I hear that anyone beats her or starves her, you are removed from the drawing forever." My aunt protested. My uncle shouted about bloodline, but 10 households raised their hands to volunteer because 250 yuan was real money in a farming village. That is how I became the child who ate from 100 homes. Not a foster daughter chosen by love, but a shared responsibility managed like a ledger. The first lot sent me to Aunt Hua, a woman with broad shoulders and a mouth like a cleaver. She bought 2 kilos of pork the day the money arrived and stewed it with potatoes. Her 2 sons shoveled meat into their mouths like wolves, and I only dared to pick at potato chunks. Aunt Hua noticed and dropped 2 pieces of pork into my bowl. "Eat," she said, as if daring me to refuse. Then she slapped her sons' hands away from the pot and scolded them. "You're eating because she's here. Don't act like pigs." That night I slept on a small cot in the corner of her room, moonlight pooling across my blanket, and I heard her confess to her husband that she had always wanted a daughter. Her husband grunted that they were already poor, but Aunt Hua said softly, "If we had more, I'd keep her for good." It was the first time I heard someone speak of me as if I were a person, not a curse. Still, 2 months later, the lot changed and I moved again, carrying a cloth bag of my few belongings like a migrant bird who never lands long enough to build a nest. The second household was the Fang family, where the mother kept a notebook to record every egg I ate and every pencil I used, as if my body were a business expense. She didn't hit me, but she sighed loudly whenever I asked for more paper, and she reminded her own children that nothing is free. The third household was old Grandpa Wei's place. He lived alone because his sons worked in the South. He treated the drawing lots money like a pension and treated me like a granddaughter he could scold without guilt. He made me recite multiplication tables while he smoked on the doorstep, and whenever I hesitated, he flicked my forehead with a bony finger. Yet when I slept, he quietly placed a hot brick wrapped in cloth near my feet because he knew the nights were cold. The fourth household was the Luo family, where I learned how it feels to be invisible. They fed me, but they never spoke to me unless they needed water carried or weeds pulled. I ate in the corner and listened to their radio soap operas, imagining voices as company. Over time, I stopped expecting affection. I began expecting patterns, and patterns were safer. The time the rooster crowed, the time the pigs were fed, the time the adults returned from the field. When you can predict a day, you can survive it. Children, however, do not run on the same gears as adults. They were the ones who taught me a different arithmetic. 1 shared roasted corn equals 1 new friendship. 1 defended insult equals 1 small brick of belonging. In the bamboo grove, I met kids who lived in houses with peeling paint, and kids who lived in brand new brick buildings built with factory wages. They argued over marbles and stole each other's slingshots, but when an adult called me Comet, several of them flinched as if the word had scraped their own skin. In spring, we braided willow branches into rings, and one girl placed hers on my head and declared I looked like a festival princess. I laughed so hard my stomach hurt. Laughter was strange then. It felt like a luxury item, like the sweet rice cakes you only tasted on holidays. At the end of each 2 months, a new stick was drawn, and I packed again. I told myself it didn't matter, because I was practiced at leaving, but my chest still tightened each time I stepped away from a familiar doorway. The village called it fairness, yet it also meant I never had a place where my shoes could stay by the same threshold long enough to shape the dust. One afternoon, walking between households with my bag, I passed my father's mud house. It had been empty since his death, windows boarded unevenly, roof sagging like tired shoulders. I stood at the gate and remembered him shouting, remembered my mother wiping blood from her lip with the back of her hand, remembered myself hiding behind the grain sacks. Memory can be cruel in the way it offers detail but refuses explanation. I reached out and touched the gate's splintered wood and thought, absurdly, that this gate had seen more of my family than I had. Then I heard Secretary Liu's voice behind me, gentle but firm. Don't stare at ruins too long. They teach the wrong lesson. He pointed to the hillside where the terraced fields rose like steps. Look there. People rebuild every season. That's what matters. That night at his house, his daughter taught me letters again, A, B, C, pronouncing them carefully like magic spells. She drew a crooked star on the page and said, "This one is the North Star. If you get lost, find it." The next day I copied the star into my notebook and labeled it in shaky English, as if writing could tie it to me. By the time I reached 3rd grade, my aunt had become a recurring villain in the village's gossip, yet she never tired. She believed blood made her entitled, and entitlement made her brave. She showed up at riverbanks, at markets, at school gates, always with a new scheme. Let me borrow your school uniform deposit. Come help me harvest beans. Give me your mother's address. Each time I said no, she acted as if my refusal were a crime. I used to shrink from her voice like an animal from thunder, but Aunt Hua's advice haunted me. The more I resisted, the more my aunt tried to prove I couldn't. She wanted me back under her roof because control was her favorite food. One day she tugged my ear in front of other adults, hissing that I had forgotten who raised me. I jerked free and said, loud enough for the whole market stall row to hear, "You raise me like you raise a pig only to sell." The words tasted dangerous. Adults stared. Someone snorted. My aunt slapped at my face, but Aunt Hua's son stepped between us, and the slap hit empty air. My aunt stormed away, and my heart pounded as if I had stolen something precious. In a way, I had stolen a small piece of my own voice back from her. The first time I used that sharpness with full force was in a warm winter break during 3rd grade. I was collecting winter bamboo shoots with Secretary Liu's son when I ran into my aunt on the mountain. She eyed my basket and demanded I hand over half, to show filial respect. I gripped the basket handle until my fingers hurt and said, 3 you want to shoot. They're worth more than meat. I'm not feeding your pigs." Her face turned dark. She grabbed my arm and spit poison into my ear. My mother didn't want me. No one would want me once the money dried up. The only blood I had was the uncle who called me bad luck. The words hit the deepest fear in me, the fear I carried like a stone in my belly. I screamed at her, clawing, biting, kicking the way Aunt Hua had described. My aunt yanked my hair and called me a stray. Then a voice cut through the wind. "I like her." It was Secretary Liu's son, taller now, holding a hoe. Behind him came Aunt Hua's sons, and several other village kids, faces angry in a way children can be when they decide something is unjust. They surrounded my aunt and demanded she let go. She released me with a hiss, retreating like a snake. My ankle was twisted and my knee bled, and one by one the older boys took turns carrying me on their backs down the mountain so no single one would tire. As we crossed the creek, I saw an old willow tree near the bank that had once stood alone and drooping. Now new shoots sprouted from its base, stubborn and green even in winter. I thought, without fully knowing why, that I could be like that, not cured, but growing anyway. That evening I did something that would have terrified me earlier. I took a hoe and dug up every vegetable my aunt had planted on the small plot that once belonged to my father. She ran over, shrieking, raising her hand to strike me, but I held the hoe between us. "This is my land," I said, voice shaking but loud. "You don't get to plant here anymore," she sputtered, calling me ungrateful. But I repeated the same sentence until it stopped sounding like a lie. People in the village whispered about my temper. Yet after that day, my aunt stopped grabbing me in public. She waited for chances, of course, but the world had changed by a millimeter, and sometimes a millimeter is the difference between drowning and breathing. Secretary Liu, seeing my stubbornness, once showed me the remittance slip's return address from my mother, an apartment district in a far city, and told me she had named me with a word that meant toward the distance. "It's her, Hope," he said. "Study. Get out. If you want answers, you'll have to walk to them." In my mind, my mother's face had already blurred, but the idea of her remained bright and impossible, like the North Star people point to when they need direction. From then on, my days had two tracks: the work I did to keep existing, and the studying I did to earn a different life. I carried water and chopped kindling, then opened books with hands that smelled of pig feed. I copied passages until the paper softened under my pen. I memorized poems while walking to the fields because time was the only thing everyone had equally, and I refused to waste mine. The village school had cracked windows and a teacher who wrote with chalk so short it barely fit her fingers. She noticed that I stayed after class to erase the board and asked why. I told her I wanted the leftover chalk dust because I could draw numbers on the dirt floor with it. She stared, then began leaving me a new piece of chalk once a week without comment. I kept it in my pocket like treasure. Sometimes, when the drawing lot's home changed, I carried my textbooks wrapped in plastic to protect them from rain. Other kids carried toys. I carried future. When I received a perfect score on a spelling test, I ran to show Aunt Min first, even if I wasn't living in her house that month, because she was the one who had bought me that first red jacket, and I wanted her to know her kindness had not been wasted. The village changed as I grew. Men left to work on construction sites in cities, returning in spring with tan lines, cigarettes, and stories about elevators. Women started small businesses, selling snacks from motor tricycles. New brick houses rose, bright and square, beside old mud homes that slumped like defeated animals. People began talking about education, the way they talked about migration as a way out, but also as a gamble. My uncle's son went to a tutoring class in town, and my aunt bragged loudly that he was a born scholar. She paid for fortune tellers to announce he carried the village's academic fate. Whenever my grades rose, she said I had stolen luck that belonged to her son. I stopped listening to her and started listening to my own patterns. If I reviewed math every morning, I improved. If I read English every night, I improved. If I let shame speak, I collapsed. Shame had been my first language. I began replacing it with effort. In my notebook, I wrote one sentence repeatedly but never twice in the same way. I can leave. I will leave. Leaving is possible. The variations mattered because each one felt like a different door opening. By 7th grade, the list of willing households had thinned, and the drawing lot system trembled under its own weight. Families withdrew, citing rising costs and children of their own. The money from my mother no longer stretched. Pork prices doubled, notebooks became more expensive. Winter coats were suddenly adult-priced. My aunt began prowling again, smelling opportunity. She offered Secretary Liu a deal. She would take me back through junior middle school if she could claim a share of my future wages and decide my marriage gifts. The calculation in her eyes was so naked it made me dizzy. I said, in front of the elders, that I would rather live alone in my father's collapsing mud house than return to her. People gasped, because in our village, children were expected to obey elders even when elders were cruel. Aunt Hua stepped forward and said, "Don't speak as if you own her." Aunt Min, who rarely confronted anyone, hugged my shoulders and declared, "We will keep her." Secretary Liu didn't raise his voice, but his words landed like stones. "She is not for sale." I cried that night. Not because I was saved, nothing was ever completely saved, but because someone had chosen me loudly enough that even the village's old customs had to listen. From then on, I studied for a different reason. I had once studied to ask my mother why she left. Now I studied to repay the people who stayed. High school was the first time I tasted what poverty feels like when it is measured in decimals. Tuition, dorm fees, uniforms, class funds, notebooks, practice tests. Each item was small, yet together they were a wall. Aunt Hua and Aunt Min scraped and borrowed to send me, cutting their own habits down to bone. Secretary Liu stopped buying his favorite liquor and drank cheap corn wine. Aunt Min wore the same socks until the heels frayed into lace. Uncle Hua quit cigarettes and rolled his own tobacco. They did not tell me these sacrifices. I learned them from details, from the way Aunt Min's hands hesitated before buying meat, from the way Uncle Hua stared too long at the price tags in town. At school, I ate rice with pickled vegetables and hot water. Not because I liked it, but because a bowl of soup cost more than my pride could allow. I bathed in cold water because I didn't want to pay for heating, and I joked to roommates that I was afraid of getting too warm, which made them laugh and also made them quiet, because kindness often wears silence to protect the recipient's dignity. My shoes, an old pair of white cloth sneakers, tore at the toe. I stitched them, melted plastic to seal the cracks, and eventually wore slippers and thin socks even in winter. My hands split from the cold and my feet swelled with chilblains that itched so badly at night I wanted to scratch off my skin. Ointment cost too much, so I endured, telling myself discomfort was a tax I could pay to buy a future. In that first semester, I also learned that poverty can turn your body into a secret you must manage. My bras were too small, my uniform too thin, and I kept my shoulders rounded to hide the awkward changes I couldn't afford to accommodate. I avoided sports because movement drew attention. When the dorm girls went to the cafeteria together, I often stayed behind and ate my fried rice alone on the top stairwell where the wind whistled, because eating in public felt like displaying need. Teachers praised my diligence, but praise doesn't buy soap. I rationed shampoo by counting pumps. I washed socks carefully and hung them where no one would see the holes. I told myself that one day I would enter a store and buy whatever was necessary without calculating. That fantasy kept me awake in a useful way. During winter break, I returned to the village and worked in the fields, not because anyone demanded it, but because I felt guilty breathing air I hadn't paid for. Aunt Min scolded me, saying, "Your job is studying," and she sounded angry only because she was scared. She had seen too many clever children quit school to work and never return to the path. Then came the day I thought I would disappear from embarrassment. It was after the midterm exams when the school posted rankings, and I had dropped far below where I wanted to be. I was already tense, already ashamed, and in that state I forgot to change the crude pad I had made from rough paper. During morning exercises, moving in unison with hundreds of students, I felt something slide down my leg. A dark red blotched paper wad fell onto the concrete in front of me. The world narrowed into a single burning point. I stomped my foot over it and froze, terrified to move. The gym teacher walked toward me, asking why I had stopped. My classmates' eyes turned like camera lenses. I wanted to fold into the ground. Then a girl's voice rose behind me, calm and quick. "Teacher, she has stomach cramps. She's my roommate and the top student in our class." The lie was generous. The teacher waved us away. The girl, Lin Wei, stepped close, blocking the view, and murmured, "Sit down." She helped me crouch, and hidden by her body, I grabbed the paper and stuffed it into my sleeve. In the dorm, she handed me a thick sanitary pad and said, "At the wholesale market, they sell them one by one. It's cheap. We can manage." Her father had died years earlier, leaving debt. She understood hunger the way a person understands their own name. That afternoon, we became friends, not with dramatic vows, but with shared practicality. Split rice, shared pickles, whispered formulas in the dark, and the kind of laughter you use to keep from cracking. Lin Wei also gave me something I had been missing: method. I had been studying like someone shoveling sand, desperate and unfocused, trying to memorize entire oceans. Lin Wei taught me to connect concepts, to build a map of knowledge instead of piling facts. She said, "It's not about how long you sit, it's about how you see." We walked back from evening study once when the campus lights failed and the path became a strip of darkness under a glittering winter sky. Lin Wei pointed at constellations and told me her father had loved astronomy and once owned a telescope before they sold it to pay hospital bills. I told her Secretary Liu had taught me a story about stars too, how the Big Dipper was a family and the smallest star in the middle was me. Speaking it aloud made my throat tighten. Lin Wei squeezed my hand and said, "We'll get out. We'll go farther than this." In that moment, I believed her with a ferocity I had never applied to anything except survival. We promised, half joking and half serious, to aim for the best universities in the country. Ambition is a flame. In poor hands, it can either burn you or light your way. I chose to hold it carefully. My academic rise did not happen smoothly. There were weeks when my brain felt like a clogged pipe and nothing flowed. There were days when hunger made my hands shake during tests. There were nights when my roommate's breathing sounded like accusations. "Why are you still awake? Why are you still trying? Why do you think you are allowed?" When those thoughts came, Lin Wei would drag me out to the corridor, point at our handwritten schedules, and say, "We don't negotiate with panic. We follow the plan." She made studying feel like something you could do even while afraid. In return, I shared the survival skills I had learned in the village: how to repair a shoe with melted plastic, how to boil cheap noodles with pickles and make it taste like comfort, how to keep quiet in front of cruel voices without letting them enter your bones. We were each other's missing instruction manuals. In spring, when the lilacs bloomed by the dorm wall, we wrote vocabulary cards and tucked them into the branches like offerings. We called it planting words. We laughed because laughter was cheaper than therapy. While my grades climbed, trouble gathered at home. Aunt Min's diabetes worsened. She had been skipping medicine to save money for my tuition, and the guilt of that knowledge scraped my ribs. Around the same time, Uncle Hua fell from scaffolding at a construction job, injuring his leg badly enough to require surgery. Contractors refused to pay hospital fees, as if a broken body were an unfortunate weather event. Their household and Secretary Liu's household, already strained by older siblings in college, were pushed to the edge. I emptied the little savings from the communal pot money accumulated from years of 50 yuan slices and placed it in Secretary Liu's trembling hands. He tried to refuse, calling it for my future, but I said, "My future is meaningless if you are sick." He accepted like a man swallowing stones. Then, as if fate had a sense of timing, my mother's money stopped arriving. 1 month passed, then another, then the third. No letter, no call. I had no phone number for her, and the address on the old slips now returned my letters stamped recipient unknown. The question that had haunted my childhood returned as a shout. Why now, when I needed it most? In the village, my aunt laughed loudly, telling everyone she had predicted it. She said my mother had thrown me away like a broken broom, that anyone who invested in me would end up cheated. Her words infected the air, and even kind neighbors began to look at me with pity that felt like contamination. I began searching for money the way hungry people search for crumbs. Everywhere, constantly, without dignity. I chopped bamboo, dug medicinal roots, trapped river crabs, carried bricks for a mason during summer break, any job that paid by the day. My hands blistered, insects bit my skin into red welts, and once a crab claw split my fingertip so blood dripped into the creek. Still, the money I earned was like pouring water into sand. In desperation, I knocked on doors of households that had once hosted me under the drawing lot system, asking for loans. Many people apologized and refused. Some said, honestly, that they were building houses now and had no spare cash. Others suggested I quit school and work, saying a girl's education was nice but unnecessary. I understood their logic and still hated it. One stormy evening, after another refusal, I slipped on mud outside a neighbor's gate and fell hard, my umbrella flipping inside out. I tried to stand and fell again, face smeared with brown sludge. For a moment I thought perhaps my aunt was right, and my life was meant to remain in the mud. That was when Secretary Liu's son found me. He lifted me up with a hand on my elbow and led me home. At dinner he announced he would quit university to find work and fund the family, because my schooling should not die here. The sacrifice made my stomach twist. I could not accept a future bought with someone else's collapse. That night I made a decision I hated. I told them, with a smile that tasted like salt, that school was boring, that I wanted to see the world early, that I would follow villagers to factory work. I pushed the lie hard because if I spoke softly it might crumble. Aunt Min cried quietly, blaming herself for being ill. Secretary Liu rapped the table once, not in anger but in helplessness. Uncle Hua stared at his injured leg like it was an enemy. As I spoke, tears fell into my rice bowl, and I bit my lip to keep from making a sound, because I believed that if I cried, I would never stop. I did not sleep. I stared at the ceiling and tried to picture a factory dorm, the metallic smell, the endless shifts, the way time would pass without changing my name. The picture felt like drowning slowly. In my chest, something stubborn refused to accept it. Yet I could not see a way out. My mother had vanished, and the adults who loved me were running out of money and health. Love without resources can still be crushed by reality. The universe offered a crooked opening. A neighbor, Aunt Meng, arrived late with a proposal. She would buy my father's old homestead plot for 4,000 yuan. Secretary Liu argued the land was worth more, mentioning the courtyard size and the mud house itself. Aunt Meng smiled thinly and said she would have to clear the abandoned structure, and that she was only helping me because she felt sorry. I knew the price was unfair. I also knew unfair money could still pay tuition. I agreed. My aunt raged when she learned, calling me unfilial, accusing me of selling ancestors. But I looked her in the eye and said, "It's my property. You wanted it so you could control me later." Her face twisted, yet she could not deny it. 2 days after the paperwork, Aunt Meng demolished the mud house quickly because, as I later learned, She had lied about her son having no bride. The new couple needed a fresh brick house immediately. I did not mourn the collapsed walls. That house had never been home to me. It had been a reminder that I began as someone's purchase. Let it fall, I thought. Let me build something else. Back at school, I lived as if every coin could hear me. I ate dry fried rice softened with hot water, saved my snack money to buy test booklets, and wrote notes on the backs of used worksheets. Linwei and I visited supermarkets on weekends because sample booths offered free bites, and we joked that we were touring the world through tiny cups. Sometimes Linwei received hand-me-down clothes from an older cousin and shared them with me. Sometimes my older foster sister mailed me a box of used shoes and coats collected from her classmates, washed and folded like quiet love. When I put on a wool sweater that still smelled faintly of unfamiliar detergent, I felt both gratitude and grief. It is a strange thing to wear someone else's warmth. My grades rose steadily. The more knowledge I gained, the more the village's prophecy of my failure lost its power. Teachers began asking me to tutor younger students, and I accepted, because tutoring came with a small stipend, and, more importantly, it made me feel like I belonged in the school's ecosystem rather than surviving on its margins. Linwei and I held each other to the plan with ruthless kindness. When one of us wanted to cry, the other would say, "Cry after you finish this set of problems," and somehow that made the crying bearable. In the final year of high school, time became a narrow tunnel. We woke before dawn. We stood in the corridor reciting English phrases while our breath fogged the windows. We solved physics questions on the back of cafeteria receipts. We ate quickly, walked quickly, wrote quickly. Our classmates wore lucky red strings on their wrists. I wore my foster mother's old thread bracelet, frayed and plain, because I trusted her hands more than superstition. Occasionally, I received a phone call from the village, and every ring made me fear bad news. Aunt Min's sugar levels, Uncle Hua's leg pain, Secretary Liu's blood pressure, the constant balancing act of small expenses. Each time, after the call ended, I felt my chest tighten. Then I opened my book again. This was my only leverage. I could not heal them with my hands. I could only become someone who could pay for medicine one day. Linwei understood this pressure. She carried her own guilt like a second backpack, because her mother worked in a textile workshop and often came home coughing. "We're racing," Linwei told me once. "Not against other students, against collapse." During those months, I started keeping a receipt of life notebook. Each page held a small transaction that didn't involve money. I wrote, "Aunt Min saved the best boiled egg for me and pretended she wasn't hungry." I wrote, "Uncle Hua repaired my backpack strap with fishing line and said it would outlast me." I wrote, "Secretary Liu's daughter mailed me 2 pens, one black and one blue, because she said a student should never be forced to borrow ink." I wrote, "Linwei shared the last piece of spicy tofu and acted like it was nothing." The notebook was my way of fighting the fear that everything good was temporary. If kindness could be written down, maybe it could become permanent enough to stand on. Once, a classmate mocked my patched shoes and asked loudly whether I was collecting charity. My face burned, and I almost reverted to the old instinct of shrinking. Linwei stepped in front of me and said, "Her shoes are patched because she knows how to make things last." "What do you know how to make last?" The classmate rolled his eyes, but he didn't answer. Later, I thanked Linwei, and she shrugged. "You defended yourself in a bamboo grove." "I'm only returning the favor in a hallway." Hearing her mention that grove she had never been there made me realize that stories travel. People had told my story as a joke, as gossip, as warning. Linwei had chosen to tell it as proof of strength. In spring, our school organized a mock exam in a neighboring county. We had to take a bus before sunrise. Most students brought boxed milk and snacks. I brought a plastic bag of pickles and 2 steamed buns Aunt Min had made and frozen. On the bus, the student next to me offered me a chocolate wafer. I hesitated because accepting gifts felt like debt. Then I remembered all the ways my foster mothers had given without asking for repayment, and I accepted the wafer and said thank you. The sweetness startled me, and for a moment it tasted like a new life. I promised myself that one day I would buy chocolate for Aunt Min and Aunt Hua, not as repayment, but as celebration. The day before the real exam, Linwei and I sat under a wisteria trellis behind the classroom building. Purple flowers hung like quiet lanterns. We recited formulas, then stopped because our voices were too tired. Linwei said softly, "If we fail, we will still live." I stared at the flowers and replied, "Yes, but we will live smaller." Lin Wei nodded and squeezed my wrist. Then let's not fail. There was no drama in it, only a shared decision. We stood up, washed our faces, and returned to the classroom like soldiers returning to formation. On the day of the college entrance exam, the testing center was crowded with parents holding umbrellas and prayer beads, with siblings carrying water bottles, with neighbors acting like devoted supporters because a child's success is considered communal glory. I stood at the gate and felt, briefly, the old hollow ache. I had no mother to adjust my collar, no father to say, "Do your best." Then I heard my name shouted in the thick accent of home. I turned and saw Aunt Hua pushing through the crowd in a too-bright dress she had bought on sale, laughing loudly that the color meant luck. Beside her was Aunt Min in a cheongsam that didn't quite fit, fussing with the hem and pretending she wasn't nervous. Uncle Hua stood a little behind them, uncomfortable in the city crowd but stubbornly present. Secretary Liu waved like a flag. My throat closed. People around us stared because it was unusual to see so many adults show up for one child. A classmate asked, surprised, whether these were my relatives. I looped my arms through Aunt Min's and Aunt Hua's and pointed at the men. "Yes," I said, voice trembling, "they're my family." After the final exam paper, when students poured out like a released flood, my family's cheers were clumsy and loud. We rode home on a single motorbike in ridiculous overload, crawling along the road under a red sky, wind carrying the mixed scent of soap from Aunt Min's clothes and dust from the fields. Aunt Hua shouted over the engine that she would kill a chicken no matter what the neighbors said about expense. Aunt Min scolded her for wasting money, then secretly smiled. Secretary Liu kept repeating, "Good, good," as if he were blessing the road itself. In that ride, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Family is not a birthright. It is a practice. The results arrived in summer heat so heavy it felt like a hand on the back of my neck. Lin Wei and I sat together with her cracked phone between us, refreshing the score page until it loaded. When the numbers appeared, Lin Wei screamed first, then laughed, then cried. I looked at my own score and felt my body go oddly light, as if gravity had loosened its grip. It was high enough to choose, high enough to step beyond the county's borders, high enough that my aunt's prophecy could finally choke on its own spit. The village reacted the way villages do. Some people congratulated loudly. Some people pretended they had always believed, and some people whispered that I must have cheated because a comet child couldn't shine. My aunt spread new rumors about me forgetting my roots. Aunt Hua, hearing it, marched straight to my aunt's gate and announced, in front of several neighbors, that any mouth that tried to curse me would be slapped shut. Secretary Liu, smiling for the first time in weeks, said he would personally walk me to the bus station. Before I left, Aunt Min handed me a small cloth bundle. Inside were 3 things: a pouch of roasted peanuts, a needle threaded with strong red string, and the old pocket compass Secretary Liu had once shown me. Aunt Min said, "Peanuts for the road, thread for repairs, compass for when you think you've lost yourself." I wanted to say something poetic in return, but my voice broke. Aunt Hua stood behind her, pretending to be bored, then shoved a folded bill into my hand and said, "Don't argue. Spend it on books, not nonsense." Uncle Hua cleared his throat loudly and looked away because men in our village didn't like being seen as soft. Secretary Liu patted my shoulder once, a measured gesture, and said, "Toward the distance." It was the same phrase he used when he spoke of my mother's naming, but that day, it belonged to me, not to her. University was not a cure. It was a new landscape where old instincts followed. I still counted costs, still apologized when I asked questions, still flinched when someone raised their voice. Yet the campus library felt like a cathedral made for people like me. Shelves rose higher than any cornfield. Students spoke in accents from provinces I had only seen on maps. For the first time, my poverty was not the center of every conversation. It existed, but it did not define the air. I found part-time work in the dining hall and learned to carry trays quickly. I applied for need-based grants and wrote essays describing my complex family situation with clinical calm. Each time I wrote it, the words felt less like a wound and more like a fact. Facts can be carried. Wounds drag. In my second year, I took the train back to the county during summer break. The village road looked narrower than I remembered, and the fields looked smaller, as if my growth had changed the scale of the world. Aunt Min's hair had more gray. Uncle Hua's leg still ached when the weather changed, but he walked without a cane. Secretary Liu's daughter had become taller, her eyes more confident. Aunt Hua waved me into her courtyard and demanded to see my student card as proof, then laughed like thunder when I showed it. That night we ate in the same courtyard where I had once swallowed tears into rice. The old fan still rattled. The moon still looked like a coin. But this time, the room felt like mine too. I still do not know where my mother went or why she stopped sending money. Perhaps she lost her job. Perhaps she remarried. Perhaps she chose forgetfulness as a cheaper form of survival. For a long time I believed finding her would heal me, that the right explanation would stitch the torn parts together. Now I am older and I know explanations are often thin. What healed me was not reunion. It was the slow accumulation of proof that I was lovable even when unprofitable. When I packed for university, I included a small notebook where I had copied every kindness I remembered, as if listing them could keep them from vanishing. I wrote down the day Aunt Min bought me a red jacket, the day Aunt Hua dropped pork into my bowl, the night Lin Wei blocked the teacher's view with her own body, the mountain dusk when children surrounded my aunt and said they liked me. I wrote them because memory is a kind of land too, and if you do not claim it, someone else will sell it out from under you. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine meeting my mother in a city street. I imagine her face older, her hair dyed, her eyes avoiding mine out of habit. I imagine asking only one question. Did you ever wonder if I ate? And I imagine her not answering, because some people cannot face the consequences of their own choices. In those fantasies, I do not beg, I do not shout. I simply turn and leave, because I already have a family that showed up at school gates and hospital beds and muddy roads. If my mother was the first person to leave me, she was not the last person to shape me, and that distinction matters. It is the difference between being abandoned and being raised. So this letter is not a plea. It is a record. It is a promise to the child who watched a silhouette disappear into snow. You will not disappear with her. You will be carried down mountains by children who decide you are worth defending. You will be taught letters by a girl drawing on dirt with charcoal. You will be fed by a woman who scolds like thunder and loves like a stone. Heavy, steady, undeniable. You will be protected by a village secretary who believes fairness can be built with rules and courage. You will find a friend who covers your shame with her own body and then teaches you how to see equations as maps. You will sell a house that was never home and still build a future. One day you will ride away from the village under a red sky, holding a compass in your palm, and you will understand that the needle points not to a place but to a direction you earn.